boy was halfway through his breakfast when the stranger walked into the mercantile and asked about work, and nobody in the room thought much of it except Sarah Callaway, who noticed the way he stood just inside the door and waited to be told where to put himself. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who had worked through hard seasons, and his coat was mended at both elbows with stitching that didn't match but held. Mrs. Henderson told him there wasn't much hiring this time of year, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she'd already decided something, and the man nodded once and thanked her and turned to leave. Sarah watched him go and thought about the loft above her barn that had stood empty since her husband died, and about the fence line that needed walking, and about the way her son Jacob had stopped asking questions about fixing things because there was nobody to ask. She set her coffee down and followed the stranger out into the cold. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he'd come west after losing a farm to debt and a wife to fever, though he didn't say any of that until later, and even then he said it the way a man mentions the weather from 2 years back. Sarah offered him the loft and meals in exchange for work, no wages, and he looked at the barn and the house and the fence line running crooked toward the hills and said that seemed fair. He moved in that afternoon with a canvas roll and a toolbox that had seen considerable use, and by evening he had replaced 3 porch boards without being asked and stacked the winter wood so it would shed water. Jacob watched him from the kitchen window until Sarah told him to set the table, which he did, though he kept looking. The first week passed in a kind of careful silence. Thomas worked from first light until the day gave out, and he worked methodically, the way a man works when he is trying to tire himself past thinking. He reset the gate that had dragged in the dirt all summer, and patched the chicken coop where a fox had been testing the boards, and he cleaned the barn stalls with the steady patience of someone who understood that animals noticed when their quarters were kept decent. Sarah brought him meals at midday, and he ate them standing or sitting on a fence rail, and he thanked her each time with the same 2 words and nothing further. She didn't press him. She had learned in her own years of being alone that some people carried their privacy like a coat, and it was unkind to ask them to take it off. Jacob was 7 and small for his age, a serious child who had taken his father's death as a problem he ought to solve by being quieter and more useful. He followed Thomas at a distance for 3 days before Thomas finally stopped at the woodpile and asked him if he wanted to learn to split kindling. The boy nodded and came forward, and Thomas showed him how to hold the hatchet and where to aim, and how to let the weight do the work. They split wood together for an hour without saying more than a dozen words, and when they were finished, Thomas handed the boy a piece of split cedar and told him it was good for keeping moths out of wool. Jacob carried it inside like a medal. By the 2nd month, the ranch had begun to look like a place where someone lived on purpose. The fence line ran true and the barn door no longer scraped, and the water trough had been rebuilt so it didn't leak a slow stream into the mud. Thomas had a way of seeing what needed mending, and mending it without ceremony, and Sarah found herself noticing things she hadn't let herself notice before, the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning, the way the hills went purple just before dark. She started baking more than she needed and bringing the extra out to the barn, and Thomas accepted it with a nod and ate it where he stood, and neither of them spoke about it, and the matter was closed. The town had opinions, which it delivered through Mrs. Henderson and her sister-in-law, who ran the post office and considered information a kind of civic duty. They thought it irregular for a widow to take in a man, never mind the loft and the separate quarters, and they said so to each other and to anyone else who would listen. But then Mr. Farley, who owned the livery, mentioned that Thomas had helped him shoe a difficult horse and refused payment, and Mrs. Kemp, who taught school, reported that Jacob Callaway had started raising his hand in class again, and by accumulation, one sighting, adding to the last, the town's theory began to shift. It shifted further when Thomas rode into town one Saturday and came back with lumber he'd paid for himself and built a new set of steps for the church, which had needed them since the winter before last, and when Reverend Marsh asked him why he'd done it, Thomas said the old steps were a danger to the elderly and let the matter rest there. Spring came late that year, the ground holding frost well into April, and with it came a man named Hiram Voss, who had sold Sarah's husband a piece of grazing land on terms that turned out to be less clear than they'd seemed. Voss arrived on a Tuesday with a deed he said gave him water rights Sarah had been using, and he informed her in front of half the town that she owed him 3 years of back fees or the use of her south pasture. Sarah, who had never owed anyone anything and whose husband had kept every paper in a locked box she still had, told him he was mistaken. Voss smiled in a way that made it clear he was used to people not arguing, and he said he'd be back in a week for his answer. Thomas was in the barn when Sarah told him, her voice tight in a way he hadn't heard before. He listened and asked to see the deed her husband had signed, and he read it slowly with the careful attention of a man who had lost something once to a contract he hadn't understood. Then he rode into town and came back with the county clerk, a dry older man named Pettigrew, who wore spectacles on a chain and didn't care for being rushed. Pettigrew read both deeds, made a small noise in his throat, and informed Sarah that Voss's claim was based on a survey error from 15 years prior that had been corrected in the territorial records, but never refiled locally. He said he would need to see Voss's original documentation, which he doubted existed in the form Voss claimed. Thomas thanked him and rode him back to town, and when Voss returned the following week, Pettigrew was waiting for him with a file of paperwork and a suggestion that Voss might want to reconsider his position before the matter became a legal expense. Voss reconsidered. He left town that afternoon and didn't come back. Sarah made stew that night, more than the three of them could eat, and she set a bowl in front of Thomas without a word. He ate it, and when he was finished, he said the fence along the north section could use attention before the cattle were moved up, and Sarah said that sounded right, and Jacob asked if he could help, and Thomas said he could. Later, after the boy had gone to bed, Sarah and Thomas sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, the night settling around them like something with weight. She said she was grateful, and he said it wasn't anything he wouldn't have done for anyone, which they both knew wasn't quite true. And she let him have the lie because some things didn't need to be dragged into the light. Summer was good to them. The cattle fattened and the garden came in strong, and Jacob grew 2 inches and started laughing at things again, the kind of easy laughter children have when they feel safe. Thomas taught him to ride better and to read tracks and to sit still in the woods until the deer stopped minding him. And in the evenings, the three of them ate together at the kitchen table and talked about the day's work or didn't talk at all, and both were comfortable. The town had stopped theorizing and started approving, which was a different thing entirely. Mrs. Henderson began asking Sarah how Thomas was getting on, her tone warmer now, as though she had always thought well of the arrangement, and Mr. Farley mentioned more than once that Brennan was the sort of man a place needed. It was Jacob who asked the question, one night in August when the heat was sitting on the land like a blanket. He asked Thomas if he was going to stay, the way a child asks a thing he's afraid to know the answer to. And Thomas looked at Sarah and then back at the boy and said he hadn't planned on leaving unless he was asked to. Jacob nodded, satisfied, and went back to the wooden horse he was carving. And Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years, a kind of loosening in her chest, as though a rope she'd been holding had finally gone slack. Thomas proposed in September, though proposed wasn't quite the word for it. They were mending the chicken coop, working side by side in the late afternoon light, and he said without preamble that he thought they managed well together and that if she was willing he'd be pleased to stay on in a more permanent capacity. He said it the way a man offers to fix a roof, plainly and without decoration. And Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at him and saw that his hands were steady and his face was calm, and that he meant every word. She said she was willing, and he nodded, and they went back to mending the coop. And that evening at supper she told Jacob, who looked at Thomas and then at her, and said he thought that was a good idea, which was all the ceremony any of them needed. They were married in October by Reverend Marsh, with Mrs. Kemp and the Henleys as witnesses, and Jacob standing beside them in a new shirt Sarah had made. The town came to the house afterward and brought food, which was the way such things were done. And Thomas shook hands and thanked people and looked faintly bewildered by the attention, and Sarah stood beside him and felt the particular pleasure of being exactly where she was supposed to be. That night, after everyone had gone, the three of them sat on the porch and watched the first stars, and Jacob fell asleep between them, and Thomas carried him to bed without waking him. The years went gently. Thomas and Sarah worked the ranch together and raised Jacob, and in time raised two more children, a girl and another boy. And the ranch prospered in the modest way of places that are tended with care. Thomas never became a man of many words, but he became a man the town relied on. Someone who showed up when there was trouble and left when the trouble was handled. Jacob grew tall and steady and learned his father's trade of quiet competence. And when he was 16, he told Thomas he was grateful, and Thomas said there was nothing to be grateful for. And Jacob let him have that the way his mother had learned to let him have things. Sarah found the letter years later after Thomas had died in his sleep at 72, a death as quiet and unremarkable as the life he'd lived. It was in the bottom of his toolbox, written on a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times, and it was addressed to a sister back east he'd never mentioned. In it, he'd written that he'd found work on a widow's ranch and a loft to sleep in, and that the boy needed a father whether he knew it or not, and that the widow herself was the sort of woman a man could build a life beside if she'd have him. He'd written that he didn't expect anything, that he'd take the loft and ask for nothing, but that he'd stay as long as they let him and do what needed doing. The letter had never been sent. Sarah folded it back along its creases and put it in the locked box where she kept the things that mattered, and that night she sat on the porch they'd built together and watched the stars and thought about the way love worked at a thing, given enough time, and how the quietest promises were the ones that held.